The lawyer's office smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, and the particular kind of silence that falls over a room right before people decide you are not worth taking seriously. It was a Tuesday in March of 1923, and I was 18 years old, sitting on a straight-backed wooden chair in the front room of Mr. Ellery Vance, attorney at law in the town of Willow Bend, Missouri. I was wearing a wool coat 2 sizes too big that I had bought for $1 off a railroad brakeman in St. Louis, and boots that had walked me the last 30 miles down from the rail yard because I had run out of money for fare. I weighed 131 pounds. I had eaten one hard-boiled egg and a piece of cornbread in the last 2 days. And I had come to Willow Bend because a letter had reached me at the rail yard, forwarded 3 times through 2 states, telling me that my great-uncle Edmund Merriweather had died in February and had left me being his only living relation the following 48 acres on the south slope of Ashner's Ridge in Douglas County, Missouri, including one farmhouse of uncertain structural condition, one spring house, one barn, and whatever livestock and personal effects remained on the property. Mr. Vance read the description without looking up from the paper. The county assessor, he said, had valued the parcel at $22. The farm, he added, had not produced a paying crop in 9 years. I remember the exact moment the laughter started because I was watching a fly crawl across the window glass behind the lawyer's head when it happened. A man named Crispin Holt, who owned the Holt Dairy on the Valley Road, and who had been sitting against the wall because he held some small claim against the estate for unpaid feed, let out a short, wet sound that he tried to cover with his hand. Then the man beside him, a land agent named Harlan Becker, who had spent the better part of a decade trying to acquire Ashner's Ridge on behalf of the Holt Dairy, which wanted the lower pasture for grazing, shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when something confirms exactly what he already believed about the world. Then Mrs. Tibbs from the boarding house, who was owed $4.40 for Edmund's last week of room and board before he had gone back up the ridge to die. Then the whole room, or what felt like the whole room, 5 or 6 people who had come to see whether old Edmund Merriweather had left anything worth picking up, and who had just learned that he had not. Mr. Vance cleared his throat and read the final clause of the will. The handwriting, he said, was the deceased's own. He read it without expression. The property shall pass to my grandniece Clara Merriweather, being the only person in this family who was ever curious about what was under the ground instead of what was on top of it. More laughter. Crispin Holt leaned back in his chair and said loud enough for the room to hear that a girl who had been living in rail yards had just inherited 48 acres of rock and cedar and sinkhole. That Edmund couldn't raise a decent hog on that ridge if the hog raised itself. That what in the world was a girl like that going to do with land like that? Harlan Becker looked at me with the flat, settled certainty of a man who has spent his entire life knowing the price of everything and found it a perfectly sufficient way to navigate the world. He said it quietly, almost kindly, the way you speak to someone you genuinely believe is beyond your ability to help. A ruined farm, he said. That is what the old man left. A ruined farm and a pile of notebooks nobody can read. He looked at me with those flat eyes. Sell it for what you can get, he said, and go back to wherever you came from. I looked at the lawyer. I looked at the paper on his desk. I looked at the small frame map of Douglas County on the wall behind him, where Ashner's Ridge was a thin green contour among larger ones, unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of place a man draws with his pencil and never thinks about again. I would like to see it, I said. Mr. Vance blinked. The property. Yes, sir. He started to say something about the house not having been properly lived in for years. I said it again quietly before he could finish the sentence. I would like to see it. I do not know what he heard in my voice. I was not being brave. I was not performing anything for the room. I was simply finished. Finished with the laughter. Finished with the room. Finished with being the kind of person that a room full of adults felt comfortable laughing at while I sat 3 feet away. I had been laughed at in the orphan's home in Jefferson City, where I had spent 9 years before they aged me out at 17. I had been laughed at by foremen on 3 rail crews who believed, with the easy confidence of men who have never been challenged on the point, that a woman of my size had no business pulling her weight alongside men. I had been dismissed and overlooked and spoken past for as long as I could remember, and the laughter in that office was not new to me, not even close to new. But it was the last time I intended to sit still and receive it without deciding what to do next. I need to tell you about Edmund before the rest of this makes any sense. Edmund Merriweather was my grandfather's younger brother, 12 years younger, which meant they had grown up as nearly separate generations. My grandfather had gone north to work in the lead mines at Joplin and died there at 39 of what they called in those days a miner's cough, which was a polite name for lungs that had turned slowly to stone. Edmund had stayed in the Ozarks. He had bought the 48 acres on Ashner's Ridge in 1887 for almost nothing, because the ridge was considered by everyone who mattered, which in Douglas County meant the men who owned the dairy operations in the valley to be essentially worthless. The soil was thin, the slope was steep. Limestone broke through the grass in long gray scars along the upper face of the ridge. The only things that grew there with any real enthusiasm were cedar trees and rattlesnakes. For the first 20 years, Edmund farmed the ridge the way everyone farmed in that country. Corn on the flat ground, a few hogs, a milk cow, a kitchen garden on the sheltered side of the house. The ridge gave him enough to eat and not much more than that, which was a common enough arrangement in Douglas County and no cause for comment from anyone. He was a quiet man. He kept to himself. He was not the kind of man people thought about very much. Then around 1910, something changed. Edmund stopped farming. He did not sell the land. He did not move away. He stayed on the ridge and he began to walk it, every acre of it, every day. He carried a leather notebook in his coat pocket and a length of fishing line with a weighted hook tied at the end. And the neighbors who encountered him would repeat the story in the feed store for years afterward, the way people repeat stories that confirm something they already believe about a man. They saw old Edmund Merriweather on his hands and knees in the cedar brake, lowering a fishing line down into a crack in the ground and counting the feet as it dropped. They saw him standing in the pasture at dawn, holding a candle at the mouth of a hole no bigger than a coffee can and watching which way the flame leaned when he held it there. They saw him pressing his ear flat against pieces of limestone, the way a man presses his ear to a door when he is trying to hear what is being said on the other side. They called him a fool, not to his face because he was a quiet man, and people are generally more comfortable being cruel about a person than directly to them. But they said it clearly enough among themselves, and it was understood in Douglas County that Edmund Merriweather had simply given up on the world and retreated into something private and probably a little sad. He was not a fool. He was the most patient man I have ever known, and I only met him once. I was 9 years old. The orphan's home in Jefferson City had arranged a visit with my one surviving blood relation, and Edmund had come down on the morning train. A small, weathered man with gray eyes, in the kind of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from having decided a long time ago that hurry was generally a waste of a person's time. There was dried mud on the cuffs of his trousers. There was a glass jar in the breast pocket of his coat. He sat with me in the visiting room for an hour, and he did not ask whether I was eating enough or whether the other children were kind to me, or any of the questions adults usually ask children in difficult situations because they do not know what else to say. He asked me if I had ever stood at the edge of a crack in the earth and felt the air coming up out of it. I said I had not. He reached into his coat pocket and set the jar on the table between us. It looked empty. The glass was clear, the lid was tight, and there was nothing inside that I could see. "This is full," he said. He said it without any performance, without any smile, the way you state a fact that you are entirely certain of. He told me he had filled it that morning from a hole on his property, a hole about 4 feet wide at the mouth and wider as it went down. He had held the jar at the edge of the opening and let the air fill it before sealing the lid. The air that came out of that hole, he said, was 54 degrees. It had been 54 degrees last summer when the outside temperature climbed past 90. It had been 54 degrees last January when the mercury dropped to 8 below zero. Summer and winter drought and wet year, the air out of that hole was 54 degrees every time he measured it. That air, he said, has been living in the dark for longer than this country has had a name. I did not understand what he meant. I was 9 years old and hungry, and I had not slept well in 3 nights, and the visiting room smelled like floor wax and coal smoke. I nodded the way children nod when an adult says something that passes over their heads, and Edmund seemed to understand that because he did not try to explain further. He simply set the jar on the table and let me look at it for the rest of the visit. But what stayed with me through 9 more years in that building, and 3 rail crews in 2 states, and every laughing room I ever sat in, was not what he said. It was the way he looked at me when he said it. He did not look at me with pity, which was the look I knew best, the one the staff at the home gave when they thought I was not watching. He did not look at me with obligation, the uncomfortable expression of someone who has come because they felt they had to. He looked at me with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who had found someone he considered worth talking to. Nobody had ever looked at me quite that way before. Nobody would again until I stood on his ridge 9 years later and began to understand what he had been trying to tell me. The road out of Willow Bend turned to gravel 2 miles past the edge of town, and then to a dirt track, and then to a path that was more intention than actual road climbing up through second-growth timber toward the limestone spine of the ridge. I walked the 6 miles from Mr. Vance's office with my duffel bag over one shoulder and a cloth sack of cornmeal and dried beans that the lawyer had pressed into my hands at the door as I left, looking at the floor when he did it. Because even small kindnesses can be given in ways that make them hard to receive without feeling smaller than you already are. His was not like that. He handed it over matter-of-factly and said nothing, and I took it the same way, and that was probably the cleaner transaction either of us could have managed under the circumstances. The track up Ashner's Ridge was steeper than I had expected, and the March light was going from gold to gray behind the cedars by the time I reached the crest. The cold had a particular character up there, not the damp cold of the valley floor, but something drier and older, the cold of exposed limestone that holds the temperature of the season in its grain and gives it back slowly, reluctantly over days. I stood at the top of the track and looked out over the Douglas County Valley spread below me. The dairy farms in the flat, the road, the grain elevator in Willow Bend, a gray finger against the sky. And I thought about nothing in particular, the way you sometimes think about nothing at all, when everything around you is so new that your mind simply goes quiet and watches. The farmhouse was smaller than I had imagined it. 2-room stone construction on the lower half, with frame above a chimney built from the same limestone as the ridge itself, intact and solid. A plank porch with one board soft enough to put a foot through if I was not careful. Windows cracked in the upper corners but not broken. Inside, a cast iron stove, a rope bed without a mattress, a plank table, 3 mismatched chairs, a shelf of books so warped from years of damp that they fanned open like a deck of cards left in the weather and the deep, specific cold of a house that has not held a fire in weeks, the kind of cold you feel in the roots of your back teeth. I found dry kindling in a wooden box beside the stove. I found matches in a tin on the shelf above it. And then I went around the side of the house and found the thing that stopped me in my tracks and held me there for longer than I can properly explain. Against the side wall of the house, under a canvas tarp, weighted at the corners with stones, was a quarter cord of split oak. It was dry. It was seasoned through. Each piece had been split cleanly, the kind of split you get from a man who knows where the grain of the wood runs and has the patience to follow it instead of fighting it. Stacked in 2 tight rows covered against the rain ready. Edmund had split this wood before he died. He had known someone was coming. He had known they would arrive in the cold, probably hungry, certainly without resources, and that the first thing they would need was a fire. He had split wood for me when he was dying. He had stacked it and covered it and weighted the corners of the tarp so the wind could not get underneath. I stood beside that wood pile in the March cold for a long time. The cedars moved in the wind above the ridge, and somewhere down the slope, a branch knocked against another branch in a dry, rhythmic way that was almost like a clock. I was not a person given easily to sentiment. The orphan's home had been a thorough education in the practical over the emotional, and the rail yards had finished whatever the home had left undone. But something in the image of a dying man's hands on an axe handle, a dying man bending to stack wood for a girl he had met once in a visiting room 9 years ago, created a pressure in my chest that I did not know how to release, except by carrying 3 armloads of that wood inside and feeding them into the stove until the room was warm enough to stop my hands from shaking. I boiled creek water and ate cornmeal mush with salt from a tin I found in the back of the cupboard. I lay down on the plank floor wrapped in my coat with my duffel bag under my head, and I listened to the clicking of the cooling stove and the wind in the cedars outside. And I thought, in the way you think things when you are very tired and very alone and the day has been too large to process properly, I will either die here or I will live here, but I will not go back to where I came from. I will not go back. The first 3 days I spent walking the property, not the 48 acres of gentle farmland people in the valley imagined when they heard the word farm. What Edmund had owned was a long spine of limestone ridge with cedar breaks along the crown and thin grass on the exposed upper slopes, and a steep fall on the south side, where the land dropped away sharply into a hardwood hollow. There was a barn with a sagging roofline on the east side, structurally present but requiring attention I could not yet afford to give it. There was a spring house built directly into the hillside about 100 yards from the main house, stone-walled with a heavy plank door and a padlock I had no key for. And everywhere on that ridge there were the cracks. The limestone was split and fractured along its length, some openings no wider than my hand lying flat, some wide enough to drop a horse into. Gaps in the bedrock where the stone had parted along ancient seams, and the slow, patient work of water and air had been widening those seams for longer than any human calendar had been keeping track. I had never seen land quite like it. A railroad man in Kansas had once used the word karst to me, explaining some territory out west where the ground was more hollow than solid, and I had nodded the way you nod when you file a word away without fully taking it in. Standing on Edmonds Ridge, I understood the word for the first time. The ground beneath me was not solid. It was a structure, a honeycomb, a system of rooms and passages that the limestone had been carving for itself since before this continent had a name. The largest crack was at the southwest corner of the property, about 4 feet across at the surface, and irregular at the edges, the stone worn smooth on either side by what looked like decades of air movement. I knelt at the edge and looked down. I could see nothing below the first few feet, only darkness and the beginning of a passage that angled away under the rock. I leaned forward, bracing my hands on either side of the opening, and the air moved against my face. Not the cold of March. Something different. Something that did not belong to the season at all. It was the cold of a temperature that does not vary the cold of a place that has been the same temperature through every drought and every heat wave and every winter that had passed over that ridge since the ridge itself was formed. It smelled of wet limestone and something almost sweet like cool water over mineral rock, and it moved steadily, slowly, the way breathing moves with a rhythm that was almost patient. I sat on my heels at that opening for a long time with the March wind at my back and Edmund's cold air on my face. I thought about a glass jar on a table in a visiting room. 54 degrees. Living in the dark for longer than this country has had a name. I went back to the house. I pulled open every drawer of the plank table. I checked the loft. I checked the space under the porch boards. On the fourth day, pushing aside a warped stack of almanacs on the shelf, I found the tin box. It was behind the almanacs, pushed flat against the back of the shelf. The kind of box that biscuits or tobacco come in painted dark green with the paint mostly worn off on the corners. I lifted it down and set it on the table. It was heavier than I expected. Inside 14 notebooks, their covers worn soft with handling. A brass compass, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket. A length of knotted cord, the knots evenly spaced at what I would later measure to be 12-inch intervals. And a letter folded twice my name written on the outside in a small, careful hand. I opened the letter first. Clara, if you are reading this, I am dead. I am sorry I could not teach you in person. The notebooks will teach you instead. Read them in order. Do not skip ahead. What is under this ridge is worth more than anything above it, and nobody in Douglas County knows it because nobody in Douglas County has bothered to look. The springhouse key is behind the stove in the mortar second course from the bottom on the left side. Your Uncle Edmund. I set the letter down on the table. I sat with it for a moment. Then I got my knife from my bag and went to the stove and felt along the second course of mortar from the bottom on the left side, pressing the blade into the joints until I found the one that gave. The key came out on the second try, coated in old mortar dust iron worn smooth at the bow from years of handling. I went out to the spring house. The padlock opened cleanly. The door was heavier than it looked, and when I pulled it open, the air that came through the opening was so different from the March cold outside that I stood in the doorway for a full moment without moving. The inside of the spring house was stone-walled, perhaps 10 feet square in the front chamber, with another door at the back, smaller, fitted with iron hinges and a wooden latch. The temperature in the front chamber was noticeably cooler than outside, but nothing remarkable. The second door was where the difference lived. I lifted the latch and pushed the inner door open. The cold hit me like a hand pressed flat against the center of my chest. 54 degrees in a room that no thermometer had touched yet. I did not need a thermometer. I had heard about this temperature my whole life, or the 9 years of it that mattered, from a small man with mud on his cuffs who had carried a jar of it on a train to show me. I stood in that inner chamber and breathed the cold air and looked at the stone walls and the stone floor and the opening in the back wall near the floor, perhaps 18 inches wide and 2 feet tall, from which the cold moved steadily upward in a way that was absolutely unmistakable once you were looking for it. A current, a breath, the ridge breathing. I went back to the house, opened the first notebook, and read. The handwriting was small and precise and extremely patient, the writing of a man who was not in a hurry and was not performing patience for anyone. He was simply patient, and the writing showed it in every line. The first entry was dated August of 1910. Lowered fishing line into the southwest crack today. Line ran out at 40 feet. Hook still dangling. No bottom. Air at the mouth of the crack 54 degrees by thermometer. Outside air 91. Dropped a pebble. Counted 4 seconds before the sound. Something is down there. I mean to find out what. I read for 5 hours without stopping. I read until the candle burned down, and I lit another from the box on the shelf and kept reading. And what Edmund Merriweather had spent 13 years doing on his hands and knees on that ridge began to come clear to me, the way a landscape comes clear as the fog burns off on a morning when the sky finally decides to cooperate. Edmund had not been wasting his time. Edmund had been mapping a cave, not a hole, not a single passage. A cave system running the full length of Ashner's Ridge beneath the limestone surface, a network of galleries and passages and chambers that had been forming since before the Ozark Plateau took its current shape, carved by water moving through soluble rock along lines of weakness in the stone, the slow, patient hydraulic work of 10,000 years. Edmund had measured and documented it all in 14 notebooks over 13 years, working alone. Working systematically, lowering his fishing line and his knotted cord into every opening he could access, marking the temperatures, sketching the passages. He could enter, mapping the layout on paper with a drafting care that surprised me, because I had not known to expect it from a man the county had dismissed as harmless and eccentric. 3 main galleries, 2 cold air vents on the upper surface, the southwest crack being the primary one, a second smaller opening on the east slope he had found in 1916, a small underground stream running clear and cold over white limestone in the deepest gallery, a stream that had no surface expression anywhere on the property and that no one above ground had any reason to know existed, and 1 main chamber 40 feet below the surface that Edmund had measured every month for 4 years running and found to be 54 degrees Fahrenheit in every season without variation. Summer, winter, drought year, wet year. 54 degrees, always. Notebook 4 contained a diagram of the spring house, precise dimensioned with notes in the margin explaining every design decision. Edmund had built the spring house directly over the primary vent of the cave system so that the cold air rising from the rock passed continuously through the stone building, through the inner chamber, around whatever was stored inside, and out through gaps he had left deliberately in the upper walls. He had not built a cold storage room. He had built a chimney for coal to channel that directed the cave's natural thermal output into a controlled agricultural space. A refrigerator, not powered by ice cut in winter and stored in sawdust, and dependent on every variable of weather and season and temperature that made the ice house business in Douglas County a gamble every single year. A refrigerator powered by nothing but the patient geological breath of the ground itself, running at 54 degrees in August when it was 95 outside, running at 54 degrees in February when it was 10 below running yesterday, and running today, and running as far as Edmund could determine for every day of the previous 10,000 years without interruption. In Notebook 7, dated 1918, Edmund had calculated storage capacity, properly constructed with slatted shelving to allow air circulation and sealed inner doors to minimize heat exchange with the outer chamber. The spring house could hold 1,200 pounds of butter, 2,000 pounds of aged cheese, or 800 bushels of apples at a temperature and humidity that no commercial ice house in Douglas County could consistently match, and at a cost of nothing beyond the labor of building the shelves. In Notebook 11, dated 1920, he had written a single line at the top of an otherwise blank page. He had underlined it twice, pressing hard enough with the pen that the ink bled slightly into the paper. The county will have ice failures in the next hard drought. Everyone stores in sawdust ice houses that depend on winter freeze. My spring house does not care what winter does. I sat on the floor of Edmund's house with the notebook in my lap and the second candle burning low in its tin and the night wind moving in the cedars outside, and I understood. I understood what Edmund had seen when he looked at his 48 acres of broken limestone that the county had called worthless for 30 years. I understood what he had spent 13 years learning and 14 notebooks recording and one very carefully built stone building demonstrating. I understood why he had turned down offers 4 times over 10 years at prices that would have been real money to a man in Edmund's circumstances, why he had stayed on the ridge, why he had lived simply and quietly and let the county call him whatever it wanted to call him. He had known exactly what he had. He had simply been waiting for someone who could use it. The next morning, I walked down into Willow Bend to buy what I could afford from the general hardware, which was not much 2 pounds of nails, a small pry bar I could use for splitting lath, and a paper bag of oats. The walk was 4 miles each way, and I made it in a pair of boots that had already given me a blister on the right heel that I was managing by keeping the lacing loose and trying not to think about it. On the way back through town, I stopped at the counter of Patton's Dry Goods for a glass of water, because the walk was 2 hours and the March day had turned warmer than expected, and while I was standing there drinking, I heard voices in the back booth of the adjoining room separated from the dry goods counter by a door frame with no door in it. I recognized Harlan Becker's voice before I saw him. He spoke with the flat, even certainty of a man who has never had cause to question whether the room is listening. He was speaking to a second man I could not initially identify, and he was speaking about the ridge. He was saying that it was a matter of timing, that the girl had no resources and no experience and no connections in the county, that the property had no commercial value as assessed, which meant no bank in Missouri would lend against it, that there was nothing on Ashner's Ridge to support a sustainable agricultural operation by any conventional measure, and that within 60 days, 90 at the outside, the practical difficulties of maintaining an operation up there with no income and no capital would bring the situation to a natural conclusion. He said those last 3 words with the satisfied deliberateness of a man who had chosen them carefully. A natural conclusion. That at that point the property would come available, and when it did, the Holt Dairy's existing interest in the lower pasture acreage could be formalized. The second man, whose voice I now recognize as belonging to one of the county commissioners, said that there was also the matter of the commercial license application. Becker said yes, he had been meaning to address that. He said that the county's existing code regarding commercial operations in areas of documented karst topography provided a reasonable basis for requiring an environmental assessment before any license could be issued, and that such an assessment, properly requested through the appropriate channels, would take no fewer than 4 months and potentially longer, and that in any case the commissioner understood the practical implications of that timeline as well as he did. The commissioner said he understood perfectly. I put my glass down on the dry goods counter quietly enough that neither man in the back booth looked up. I picked up my paper bag of oats and my hardware, and I walked out of Patton's Dry Goods and back up the valley road toward the ridge. And I walked the whole 4 miles with the same steady pace I had walked in, because the worst thing I could have done in that moment was let my pace tell anyone watching that I had heard something. I had grown up in an institution that ran on observation and the judicious management of what you let other people see. I knew how to walk normally when nothing about the situation was normal. I thought about what I had heard the entire way back up the ridge. Becker had been trying to purchase Ashner's Ridge for 10 years. He had failed 4 times with Edmund, who had been a 60-year-old man living alone with no dependents and no financial pressure, and every reason to hold on to what he had. I was 18 years old with no money, no connections, no established residence in Douglas County, and a commercial license application that a county commissioner had just agreed. Over coffee and probably some form of consideration, I had not been present to witness to stall for 4 months. Becker was not wrong about my situation. He had assessed it accurately from most angles. What he had not assessed was what was in the 14 notebooks. What he had not assessed and could not have assessed because nobody in Douglas County had bothered to look was what was under the ground of the property he had spent 10 years trying to acquire. He thought he was waiting for a natural conclusion. He did not know that the thing he was waiting on had been running at 54 degrees for 10,000 years and was not going to stop on his schedule or anyone else's. I reached the ridge as the afternoon light turned flat and thin over the cedars. I carried my hardware inside. I built a fire in the stove. I sat down at the plank table and opened Notebook 1 again and read the first entry one more time. Edmund's small, precise words on the lined paper. The date in August of 1910. The fishing line running down 40 feet into the dark with the hook still dangling and no bottom found. Something is down there, he had written. I mean to find out what. The cold air was moving through the limestone beneath me, steady and unhurried, indifferent to Harlan Becker and county commissioners and commercial license applications and every other mechanism by which the world tried to convince you that what you had was worthless. It moved because it had always moved. It maintained its temperature because the geology of the Ozark Plateau had been building toward that temperature for longer than any human ambition had been around to complicate it. I was 18 years old. I was hungry. My right heel was bleeding into my boot. I had no money and no allies, and a man with connections was quietly arranging for the county apparatus to run out my clock. And I had 14 notebooks written by a patient man who had spent 13 years on his hands and knees learning to read the ground beneath his feet, in a spring house that ran at 54 degrees in every season without fail. And a letter that said the notebooks would teach me what he had not been able to teach me in person. I got up, walked to the shelf, and picked up Notebook 2. I built a fire high enough to last, pulled my chair close to the stove, and I began to read. Edmund's second notebook was not a continuation. It was a correction, the interior argument of a man who had spent his first year of investigation learning to distrust his own conclusions until the evidence made them unavoidable. He had a scientist's discipline without a scientist's training, which meant he had arrived at his methods by necessity rather than instruction. And the methods he had arrived at were in their own way, more rigorous than anything a trained man might have brought to the same problem. He had no one to consult. He had no framework to borrow. He had only the ridge and the notebooks and the patience to keep going back to the same cracks in the same limestone with the same fishing line until the measurements stopped surprising him and started confirming each other. I read through the night. I read through the morning. I fell asleep in the chair somewhere near noon with Notebook 4 open across my knees and woke 2 hours later with the fire low and the room cold again and the specific disorientation of a person who has slept in the middle of the day and returned to a world that has not waited. I rebuilt the fire. I ate the last of the cornmeal dry this time, which was not a good way to eat cornmeal, but was functional, and I went back to the notebooks. By the end of the 4th day, I had read all 14. By the end of the 5th, I had read them again in order this time, with a piece of brown paper torn from the oat bag and a stub of pencil I found in the table drawer, making my own notes in the margins of the brown paper, cross-referencing Edmund's measurements, checking his calculations against each other, the way you check the addition in a column of figures looking for the places where the numbers did not agree. There were almost none. Edmund had been careful to the point of obsession, which was the correct level of care for what he was doing, because the thing he was building his entire argument on was the consistency of the temperature, and a single anomalous reading could have unmade the whole structure if he had not been scrupulous about recording it. He had been scrupulous. The temperature at the southwest vent was 54 degrees in August of 1910, and 54 degrees in January of 1911, and 54 degrees every month he had recorded for 13 years. The only variation was in the decimal, and the decimal was always within a single degree of the baseline. It was not approximate. It was geological fact as reliable as the limestone it came through. What Edmund had built in the spring house was not complicated in principle. It was only complicated in vision. The principle was simply that cold air is heavier than warm air and will flow downhill through any available passage, and that a cave system maintaining a constant temperature will exhale that temperature upward through its surface vents whenever the outside temperature rises above it, which in the Missouri Ozarks means approximately 9 months of every year. All Edmund had done was build a room over the primary vent and give the cold air nowhere else to go but through the storage space he had designed. The shelves were slatted to allow circulation. The inner chamber was sealed from the outer one to prevent heat exchange. The gaps he had left in the upper wall of the outer chamber allowed the warmed air to exit after it had done its work, passing over whatever was stored inside. The whole system was a single continuous movement, cold in at the bottom, warm out at the top, driven by nothing but the temperature differential between the cave and the outside world. In Notebook 7, Edmund had noted with the understated satisfaction of a man who rarely permitted himself satisfaction that the system required no maintenance beyond keeping the doors in good repair and the vents clear of debris. He had written it will outlast every ice house in this county by at least a century, assuming the doors hold. The doors were holding. I had checked them twice. I spent the first week of April taking inventory of what I had to work with, which was the kind of accounting that is useful primarily because it forces you to see your situation clearly rather than approximately. Clearly, I had the spring house, which was the most valuable agricultural facility in Douglas County, and which no one in Douglas County knew about except me and a dead man. I had the inner chamber empty of everything except cold air. I had 14 notebooks that constituted a complete operational guide to running a cold storage business on those premises, written by the man who had designed the premises for exactly that purpose. I had a barn with a sound floor and a questionable roof, 2 acres of reasonably level ground on the northeast face that could support a kitchen garden once the frost was done, a spring house key, and approximately 60 cents in my coat pocket. What I did not have was product capital, a commercial license, or any realistic prospect of obtaining the license before Harlan Becker's arrangement with the county commissioner ran its course. What I did not have was anyone in Douglas County who was prepared to take me seriously as a person conducting a business as opposed to a girl in an oversized coat who had inherited a problem she did not yet understand. What I did not have was time to wait for any of those things to resolve themselves on their own. I started with the shelves because the shelves I could build with materials I had and skills I could acquire by doing. Edmund's diagram in Notebook 4 specified slatted oak, each slat 1 inch thick and 3 inches wide, with a ½ inch gap between slats for air circulation, mounted on rails of the same material, the whole assembly set into the stone walls of the inner chamber at intervals of 18 inches vertically. He had specified oak because it was the hardest common wood in the Ozarks and would not absorb moisture or harbor the kind of microbial activity that softer woods develop in consistently cool, damp environments. He had noted in the margin in his small, careful hand that the shelves must not touch the floor so that the cold air column rising from the vent could pass freely beneath the lowest shelf before beginning its upward circulation through the storage space. The barn had seasoned oak stacked along the south wall boards of various widths that Edmund had clearly put by for exactly this purpose. A man who spent 13 years preparing a facility does not leave the building materials to chance. There was a handsaw on a nail beside the stack, its blade oiled against rust usable. There was a brace and bit for drilling. There were iron nails in a coffee tin sorted by size in a way that told you something about the person who had sorted them. I had never built shelving before in any serious sense. I had nailed boards together in the maintenance shop at the orphan's home when I was 12 and been told I had no feel for it, which may have been true then. What I found now was that feel is largely a matter of attention, and that attention is largely a matter of having no alternative. The first section of shelving I built was not level, and the second slat from the top was too narrow for the specified gap. I pulled it apart and built it again. The second attempt was better. The third was better than the second. By the end of the first week, I had 6 feet of shelving installed in the inner chamber and hands that were cracked at every knuckle from the cold stone and the dry wood and the work, and I had learned more about the relationship between a saw and a straight line than I had known existed to learn. I ate what I could find and what I could afford. The beans from the sack in the barn that the mice had sampled, but not ruined. The oats boiled with water and a small amount of the salt from the tin. Watercress from the creek at the bottom of the South Hollow, which was cold and clean and abundant, in which I ate in quantities that would have seemed unreasonable to anyone who had not been subsisting on cornmeal and boiled grain for 3 weeks. I lost weight I did not have to lose. There was a particular morning in the third week of April when I stood up from where I had been kneeling to fit a shelf bracket, and my vision went gray at the edges for a moment, before it cleared and I sat back down on the cold stone floor of the spring house and waited for my head to settle and thought about what I was going to do if I ran out of the ability to do anything before any of the other problems resolved. I was still sitting there when I heard Boots on the path outside. He was a tall man, thin in the way that comes from decades of physical work rather than from any shortage, with a face the color of old walnut wood and hands that were larger than his frame quite accounted for. He was carrying a clay jar sealed with a cloth and a loaf of bread wrapped in a clean dish towel, and he stood at the door of the spring house and looked at the shelves I had been building without saying anything for what felt like a long time. His name was Zebediah Pruitt, though he told me at the outset that everyone who knew him called him Zeb, and that he preferred it. He was 71 years old. He ran 40 acres of dairy pasture 3 miles south of the ridge, had run it for 30 years, and had known Edmund Merriweather for most of that time. He set the jar and the bread on the shelf nearest the door and looked at my work and said nothing for another moment. He told me once Zeb said finally that he was building something that would still be useful 100 years after he was gone. He said it without turning from the shelves. He had not looked directly at me yet, which I understood to be courtesy rather than avoidance. The particular courtesy of a man who knows that looking directly at someone who is struggling can sometimes make the struggling harder. I didn't believe him, Zeb said. Most people didn't. Most people don't know what to make of a man who isn't in a hurry. He picked up the cloth on the bread and looked at it briefly and set it back down. He said without particular emphasis that I looked like I hadn't eaten a proper meal in some time, and that the buttermilk was fresh this morning, and the bread was his wife Nella's recipe, with a little bit of honey from their own bees, and that I should eat before we talked about anything else, because a person does not think as clearly on an empty stomach as they believe they do. I ate. I ate half the bread and drank most of the buttermilk and sat on the floor of the spring house with my back against the cold stone and felt the difference in my body, the way actual food registers differently than caloric adequacy, the way your thinking clarifies when the physical noise of hunger stops interfering with it. Zeb sat on the step outside the door and waited. When I was done, he asked without turning around whether I needed help with the shelves. I said I did. He came every Saturday after that, and sometimes on Wednesdays when his dairy work allowed it. He worked without ceremony and without requiring conversation to fill the silence, which was the kind of working partner I had not known I needed until I had one. He knew tools in the particular way that people know things they have been using since childhood, not as objects with functions, but as extensions of a set of habits, so deeply established they have become instinct. Watching him work told me things about woodworking that no explanation could have communicated in the same time. He came on shares a portion of whatever the spring house produced when it began producing anything. He said this matter-of-factly as a straightforward business arrangement between two people with complementary resources, which was exactly what it was. He did not make it into something larger or more sentimental than that which I respected. Sentiment is a fine thing in its place, but it is not a business model, and I had already learned enough from Edmund's notebooks to know that what I was building needed to be a business before it could be anything else. It was on the third Saturday in the second week of April that Zeb set down his saw and told me to follow him. He took me through the inner chamber of the spring house, past the new shelving to the back wall where the cold air vent rose from the rock below. Along the right side of the back wall at roughly knee height, there was a section of stone that looked no different from any other section, gray limestone with the particular granular texture of the Ozark Formation. Zeb pressed two fingers against a specific point in the wall, and the stone gave slightly not the stone itself, but a thin piece of it, a flat slab perhaps 6 inches square set into the wall like a plug, mortared around the edges, but not bonded, designed to be removed. He worked it free carefully and set it on the floor. Behind it was a cavity, roughly the size of a large shoebox cut into the living rock. Inside the cavity was a manila folder. Inside the folder was a sheaf of papers. Edmund had written on every page in the same small, precise hand as the notebooks. But these were not field notes. These were records of negotiation, 4 separate documented instances spanning from 1913 to 1922. Each one a full account of a meeting between Edmund and Harlan Becker on the subject of the purchase of Ashner's Ridge. Edmund had recorded the date of each meeting, the location, the specific figures Becker had offered, the specific arguments Becker had made, and his own responses. The first offer in 1913 had been $180 for the full parcel, framed as a generous acknowledgement of land that the county assessor valued at less than a quarter of that sum. Edmund had declined. The second offer in 1916 had been $240, accompanied by an argument about the difficulty a man of Edmund's age would face in maintaining property he was no longer actively farming, and an implicit suggestion that the sensible thing was to take the money while it was being offered. Edmund had declined again. The third offer in 1919 had been $290, with a mention of the Holt Dairy's intention to develop the Valley Road property in ways that would benefit the surrounding area, and a less implicit suggestion that property owners who chose not to participate in the county's development might find themselves somewhat isolated from its benefits. Edmund had declined a third time. The fourth offer in 1922 had been $340, the highest Becker had gone delivered, with what Edmund described in his notes as a new quality of impatience, as though Becker had finally stopped believing that the right number would change the answer. At the bottom of each account, in a line set apart from the rest of the text, Edmund had written his annotation. They were brief. The first said, "Only he knows there is something here. He does not know what." The second said, "He is buying for Holt. Holt wants the lower pasture for summer grazing. This tells me Becker has not looked at the upper third of the property." The third said, "The pressure is increasing. This means the value is increasing. Hold." The fourth, written in 1922, the year before Edmund died, said, "He will come again. He will not stop. The property must not go to him under any circumstances. He would fill the vents to keep the cows from breaking their legs on the karst. He would destroy in a month what took 10,000 years to make." I read through the folder twice, standing in the cold of the inner chamber, with the air moving past my ankles. Then I folded it and put it back in the cavity and replaced the stone plug, and stood there for a moment with my hand flat against the wall. Becker had known or suspected for at least 10 years that something about Ashner's Ridge was worth more than its assessed value. He had not known what. He had tried to buy it 4 times and failed because Edmund had understood the situation with perfect clarity and had refused at every price. Now Edmund was dead, and I had the property, and Becker had a commissioner in his pocket, and 4 months of licensing delay to run my clock down to a natural conclusion. What Becker did not know, what he could not have known because no one had bothered to look, was that I had read 14 notebooks. What he did not know was that the thing he had been circling for 10 years was already in operation, already doing its work in the dark, and that I was standing inside it. I went back out to where Zeb was fitting a shelf bracket and told him what I had read. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he picked up the brace and set the bit against the wall and began drilling the pilot hole for the next bracket mounting point. He said that Edmund had never shown him the folder, but that he had suspected something like it existed because Edmund was not a man who left his reasoning undocumented. He said that the situation with the license was going to require patience and that I had to get product established before the license question resolved itself, because the license question would resolve itself differently depending on whether I had product or not. A girl with empty shelves asking for a commercial license is one thing. A girl with full shelves and a buyer who has already paid is another. He said, "You need something to sell. You need it before July." I had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it from a man who had been operating in this county for 30 years gave it a different weight. In the second week of May, I walked down to West Plains, which was a longer walk than Willow Bend, but where there was a small creamery operation that Zeb knew was running short on the capital needed to age its product properly. The owner was a heavy-set man named Orrin Voss, who received me across his work counter with the particular skepticism that a man in a marginal business applies to any proposition that sounds better than what he currently has, which is to say cautiously, waiting for the part where the trouble reveals itself. I told him I had cold storage capacity at a consistent 54 degrees and was looking to take on green cheese for aging. He said he had 30 pounds of it he had been meaning to age and had nowhere suitable to do it. I said I would take it on consignment and pay him his share when it sold aged. He looked at me for a moment longer than he needed to, not unkindly, and then he said that he supposed there was no particular reason not to, and he called his boy to bring the rounds from the back room. I carried 30 pounds of green cheese up the ridge on my back in a pack frame I had rigged from boards and canvas. I installed each round on the slatted shelves of the inner chamber with the care of a person who understands they are handling the primary evidence in an argument they have not yet finished making. The cold received them without comment. Zeb taught me the rest. He had been aging cheese on a small scale for 20 years, not commercially, but for his own table, and for the neighbors who knew enough to ask, and he knew the process with the same embodied certainty he brought to everything else. How to turn the rounds on a schedule so they aged evenly. How to monitor the surface for the kind of growth you wanted and the kind you did not. How to salt butter for long storage, packing it into crocks with the right amount of brine to hold it through summer without it going rancid. Which buyers in Springfield paid cash without argument, and which ones would look at a young woman arriving alone and calculate how much of her margin they could absorb on the assumption that she did not know her own numbers. She knew her numbers. I had learned them from Edmund, who had calculated his projected income from the spring house in Notebook 8 with the same precision. He applied to his temperature measurements, and I had checked his arithmetic and found it sound, and I had built my own projections on top of his in the margins of my brown paper, and I knew what a pound of properly aged cheese should bring in Springfield in the summer of 1923, within a margin that I could defend. Miss Louetta Strand arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early June, climbing the ridge track in a sensible pair of low boots and carrying a clipboard and a canvas bag that clinked when she moved, which was the sound of glass thermometers in a padded case. She was the county extension agent, a woman in her early 40s with a direct manner and the slightly compressed expression of someone who has spent years being taken less seriously than her competence warranted and has made a functional peace with it without accepting it as fair. She had heard about the ridge operation from the grocer in Willow Bend, she said, and she had come to see it. I showed her everything. The spring house, the inner chamber, the shelves with the cheese rounds aging in the cold. The vent opening in the back wall, the cold air moving steadily upward from the cave system below. The notebooks. She read through notebooks 1 through 4 standing up, and then she sat down on a crate and read notebooks 5 and 6, and then she stood up again and placed her hand flat on the stone wall of the inner chamber and held it there. She said that she had read about natural cold air caves in an agricultural journal out of Wisconsin, a paper from the university there discussing the theoretical applications of consistent subterranean temperature for food storage. She said she had not known there was an example in Douglas County. I said there was this one. She said she would like to bring someone from the University Agricultural College at Columbia, a man named Dr. Fenwick, who had been working on questions of natural refrigeration in karst terrain. I said that would be fine with me. Dr. Fenwick came the following week, a quiet man in his 50s who arrived with more equipment than I expected and spoke less than I would have predicted from a man of his credentials. He spent 2 full days on the ridge measuring the temperature in the inner chamber with calibrated instruments every hour on the hour, through both days and nights, sleeping 3 hours on a cot. He brought himself, eating crackers and dried beef from his canvas bag, and writing in a separate notebook that he kept in his inside coat pocket and did not show me. When he left on the third morning, he shook my hand without excessive ceremony and told me that he would be submitting a report to the Missouri State Department of Agriculture and that I would likely hear from them within the month. What I heard first was from the county. In the second week of July, 6 weeks after I had submitted my application for a commercial food storage license, I received a written notice from the Douglas County Clerk's office informing me that my application had been placed in a review queue pending an environmental assessment of commercial operations in areas of documented karst topography, as required under a county ordinance, that the notice described in language precise enough to sound like it had been prepared by someone who understood it was going to be read carefully. The assessment, the notice said, would take a minimum of 4 months. I read the notice twice at the kitchen table. Then I folded it and put it in the tin box with Edmund's letter and the key and set the box back on the shelf behind the almanacs. Zeb came on Saturday. He read the notice and folded it back along the same lines. He said that we would sell through him for the duration that his existing license for agricultural product sales out of his property would cover transactions where he was the documented seller, and that the Springfield buyers he dealt with did not ask more questions than the paperwork required. He said it without inflection as a statement of available options rather than a complaint about the options available. I said that we would operate on shares through his license until the assessment resolved itself. He said that sounded right and picked up his tools and went back to work on the second extension of shelving we had been fitting along the north wall of the inner chamber. It was Zeb who negotiated the first sales in Springfield, driving down on Fridays in his truck, with whatever was ready for market returning with cash, that he divided on the kitchen table between us with the straightforward arithmetic of a man who does not complicate honest dealing with unnecessary formality. The arrangement worked because Zeb was known in Springfield because his reputation for honest product was established over decades, and because the buyers he chose were men who had bought from him before and knew the difference between product handled well and product handled in the shortcuts that marginal operations tend toward. But the cheese was mine. The aging was mine. The cold was Edmund's, which meant by inheritance and by the fact that I had read 14 notebooks and built 12 feet of shelving with cracked hands while eating watercress and boiled oats, it was mine as well. The rounds had been in the inner chamber since the second week of May. By the first week of August, they had been aging for nearly 12 weeks. I turned them on their schedule every 3 days. I monitored the surface condition every morning. I recorded the chamber temperature every day at the same hour in a 15th notebook I had started on the blank pages at the back of Edmund's last volume. The temperature did not vary. On the morning of the 8th of August, I cut into the first finished round with a knife I had sharpened on the whetstone I found in the barn. The cheese was pale gold at the center, firming toward the rind with the slight granular texture that comes from proper aging and cool circulating air. It smelled of grass and mineral stone and the particular clean sharpness that distinguishes aged product from cheese that has merely been left alone. I cut a wedge and tasted it and sat for a moment with the taste in my mouth, which was the taste of something that had been done correctly from the first step to the last. I wrapped the round in the clean cloth Zeb had brought up and put it in my pack frame and walked down to Willow Bend the next morning. Not to Springfield, where Zeb handled our sales. To Willow Bend, to Patton's General Store, where the same grocer who had been doing business in this county for 25 years had looked at me 8 months ago as part of a room full of people deciding I was not worth serious attention. I set the wrapped round on his counter and unwrapped it and asked him to taste it. He cut a small piece with his own knife and put it in his mouth. He looked at me. He chewed slowly and deliberately the way a man tastes something when he is making a professional assessment rather than simply eating. Then he looked down at the counter for a moment and then back at me. He said, "Where did you age this?" I said, "In my spring house." He said that no county spring house aged cheese this cleanly. He said it with a slight edge of challenge in it, the question behind the statement being whether I was going to tell him the truth or a version of it. I said, "Mine does." He looked at the round again. He looked at me. And then he pulled a chair out from behind the counter and sat down in it slowly without explanation, with the expression of a man who has just been required to adjust a calculation he had considered settled. He sat in that chair for 10 seconds without saying anything. Then he told me what he would pay for the round, and the number he said was enough that when I walked out of Patton's General Store and sat down on the wooden step outside, I sat there for a full minute with my hands on my knees and the morning sun on my face not moving, just receiving the information that something I had built with my own hands and my dead uncle's knowledge had just been recognized by the market as exactly what I had always known it was. The people who had laughed in Mr. Vance's office had looked at 48 acres of broken limestone and seen nothing worth keeping. Edmund had looked at the same ground for 30 years and seen something that had been running since before this continent had a name. I had read his notebooks by candlelight with cracked hands and empty pockets and built what he had designed and filled it with product and walked it down a ridge road in a pack frame on my back. And now I was sitting on the step outside the store where the county came to buy its staples, and a man who had spent 25 years knowing the price of everything in Douglas County had just sat down in his chair. I was not done. The cheese in the inner chamber, the license still being reviewed, the 4 months of delay Harlan Becker had arranged with a county commissioner over coffee, none of it was resolved. The shelves were not yet full. The second extension Zeb and I had been fitting was not finished. The barn roof needed attention I had been deferring. The blister on my right heel had healed and been replaced by a callus, which was progress of a practical kind, but was not the same as being finished. But I sat on that step and let myself feel the weight of what had just happened, because there are moments when a person owes it to the work they have done to sit still and acknowledge that the work was real and that the real things built from it are real as well. Edmund had done that work for 13 years in the dark and had never seen what it produced. I had been on the ridge for 5 months, and I had just seen the beginning of what it could produce, and I intended to see the rest. I stood up, shouldered my empty pack frame, and walked back up the ridge. When I arrived, I checked the temperature in the inner chamber and wrote the reading in the 15th notebook. I checked the surface of each remaining round and found nothing that required attention. Then I went into the house, built a fire, and made a list of what needed doing next. There was always a next. Edmund had understood that. 13 years of next, 14 notebooks of next, a spring house built on a next that he did not live to see completed, but had prepared for with the kind of care that does not require an audience, because the work itself is the point. The license would come or it would not. Becker would make another move or he would wait. The ridge would keep breathing at its own temperature, regardless of what either of them decided. I was 18 years old, and I had 1 round of cheese in the hands of a grocer who had sat down in his chair and 30 more on the shelf, and a dead man's notebooks full of the next 30 years of what this land could do. I wrote the temperature in the notebook and closed it and set it on the shelf. Then I went back to the shelves and went back to work. The letter from the Missouri State Department of Agriculture arrived on a Thursday morning in the last week of September, delivered by the rural mail carrier who left it wedged in the gap between the porch post and the railing, because I was up at the barn when he came and not there to receive it in person. I found it when I came down at midday, a cream-colored envelope with the state seal on the upper left corner. And I stood on the porch in the autumn light and opened it with the particular steadiness of a person who has been waiting for news long enough that the arrival of the news is almost secondary to the fact of the waiting being over. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph identified me and the property. The second paragraph informed me that following the receipt of Dr. Fenwick's report from the University of Missouri Agricultural College, the department had undertaken a direct review of the commercial license application for the Ashner's Ridge cold storage facility and had found the application to be in compliance with all applicable state standards for agricultural food storage operations. The third paragraph stated that the department was directing the Douglas County Clerk's office to issue the commercial license forthwith, and that any county-level procedural requirements previously cited as grounds for delay had been reviewed and found to be inapplicable to the present application under state agricultural code. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original creases and put it in the tin box with Edmund's letter and the key, and I went inside and built a fire and made coffee from the last of the coffee I had been rationing for 2 weeks. And I sat at the plank table and drank it hot and black, and thought about Harlan Becker sitting across from a county commissioner at Patton's dry goods counter in March, arranging what he had described as a natural conclusion, and about the particular quality of patience required to watch a natural conclusion arrive at a result that is the precise opposite of the one it was designed to produce. The commercial license came from the county clerk's office 4 days later, delivered without comment, and signed by the same commissioner whose voice I had recognized in the back booth of Patton's. The signature was neat and official and gave no indication of any sentiment about the document it authorized. That was fine. I did not need sentiment from the county commissioner. I needed the license and I had it. The autumn of 1923 moved forward with the weight of something that has found its proper speed. Zeb and I finished the second extension of shelving in early October, opening an additional 30 feet of storage capacity in the room Edmund had roughed out, but never completed the stone already cut. The dimensions already planned the whole second chamber, waiting in the dark for someone to finish what had been started. We worked 2 full weekends on the extension, and one Wednesday afternoon, when Zeb's dairy work let him go early, and when it was done, I stood in the completed inner chamber and looked at the full length of slatted oak shelving running along both walls, empty and clean, and smelling of new wood and cold stone, and understood for the first time the full scale of what Edmund had been building toward. By November, I had contracts with 4 creamery operations in Douglas County, small dairies that could not afford their own aging facilities, and who had heard through the county grapevine, which in a place like Douglas County is both faster and more accurate than any official communication, that the Meriwether Spring House on Ashner's Ridge was producing aged product at a quality and consistency that the Springfield buyers were willing to pay a premium for. The premium was real. I knew what it was because I had priced it myself using Edmund's notebook, 8 projections as my baseline and adjusting upward for the demonstrated quality of the first rounds, which the Willow Bend grocer had sold within 2 days of receiving them and had immediately asked for more. The contracts I wrote were straightforward, the kind of agreements that working people in agricultural communities understand without needing a lawyer to explain them. Terms set in plain language with clear numbers and clear timelines, and no provisions designed to benefit one party at the other's expense. I made more money in the autumn of 1923 than I had earned in 3 years of rail work. I put most of it back into the operation. A new roof for the barn, which I hired out to 2 brothers from the Valley Road, who did the work in 3 days for a price I could manage. Better caulking compound for the inner chamber door seams. A proper thermometer to replace the borrowed one. I had been using a calibrated instrument from a scientific supply house in St. Louis that read to within 1/10 of a degree, and that I mounted on the inner wall of the chamber at Edmund's specified height, which was the height at which the air temperature most accurately represented the storage conditions for the full volume of the space. New notebooks, 6 of them, blank for the records I would keep on behalf of whatever came next. Zeb bought a new truck in November secondhand, but sound, which made the Springfield runs faster and allowed us to increase the frequency of deliveries. His wife Nella sent up a jar of preserved peaches with him one Saturday in October, packed in syrup she had put up from their own trees, and I ate the entire jar over 3 days and thought that I had not eaten anything that good since the visiting room in Jefferson City, where Edmund had sat across from me with mud on his cuffs and a jar of invisible air in his pocket, and looked at me like someone worth talking to. The winter of 1923 into 1924 was mild, in the way that Ozark winters occasionally are, the kind of mild that feels like a gift in January and reveals itself as a problem by July. The ponds did not freeze deep. The commercial ice houses in Springfield and Rolla and West Plains sent their cutters out in February and cut what they could, which was ice of reduced thickness from ponds that had not given their full cold to the season. And they packed it in sawdust in their storage houses and kept their books as though the summer ahead would behave the way summers usually behaved, which was an assumption that the summer ahead was not going to honor. My spring house cut no ice and packed no sawdust. My spring house ran at 54 degrees in February of 1924, the same way it had run at 54 degrees in August of 1923, with the same movement of cold air rising through the same limestone vents in the same karst formation that had been producing the same temperature for the same geological reasons for longer than the state of Missouri had existed. I noted the February reading in the record notebook the same way I noted every reading. I did not think very much about what the mild winter meant yet. I was thinking about the spring planting I was going to attempt on the northeast face. The kitchen garden expanded to a market garden, another source of product for the cold storage inventory. I was thinking about the barn roof, which the brothers had done well, but which needed a coat of sealant before the spring rains. I was thinking about the third batch of cheese I had recently moved to the inner chamber, 60 pounds this time. From two different creameries, the largest single intake the operation had yet handled. The spring came warm and stayed warm. The creek at the bottom of the South Hollow, which ran generous and cold through a normal April, was running low by the end of May. The pasture grass on the valley farms, which should have been green and thick through June, began showing the gray-brown at the edges. That means the roots are not getting what the leaves need. The farmers in the valley watch their pastures and their rain gauges and talk to each other at the feed store with the particular combination of concern and forced practicality that farming communities use to discuss things they cannot change. By the end of June, the creek was a series of pools connected by thin threads of water over gravel, and the valley road was throwing up dust in a way it did not usually throw dust until August. I watched it from the ridge. The spring house was full, the fullest it had ever been, enough product for 40 families cooling at 54 degrees while the outside temperature climbed past 80 and kept going. I had two contracts with Springfield buyers that specified weekly delivery through August, and I was meeting them. I had three new contracts with smaller operations signed in June, dairy farms that had heard about the Ridge facility and wanted to get their summer inventory into cold storage before the heat made the question urgent. I was running at near capacity in the main chamber and had begun using the second room for overflow, just as Edmund had planned. July came in hot and stayed that way. The pastures burned from green to tan to the pale, exhausted color of straw that has been baked in an oven. The creek went dry. The springs in the valley, the natural ones that dairy operations had depended on for secondary cooling, ran warm and then ran low, and then in some cases stopped running altogether. The commercial ice houses in Springfield reported that they were at 40% of normal inventory by the 15th of July, a figure that would not have been alarming in a normal summer, because the remaining ice should have lasted through August with careful management. The summer was not managing itself carefully. The temperature at Springfield on the 20th of July was 103 degrees. The ice went faster than anyone had planned for. Heat does not respect projections made in cooler weather, and the sawdust insulation that worked adequately in a normal summer was not designed for sustained triple-digit temperatures that lasted not for days but for weeks. The Springfield Ice House reported reaching critical inventory by the 1st of August. The Rolla operation, smaller and dependent on a single pond that had given thin ice in February, ran out entirely in the third week of July and sent its customers notice by telegram. The West Plains facility lasted into early August before its inventory fell below the threshold where it could maintain adequate temperatures for dairy product storage, which meant that every dairy operation within its service area was suddenly looking at butter going soft and cheese rooms climbing into the 70s and milk souring before it reached the collection point. Crispin Holt, who operated the largest dairy in Douglas County and who had relied on a combination of his own ice house and the Springfield commercial facility for his summer storage needs, lost 600 pounds of butter in a single week in August. His ice house was empty. His spring house, a conventional design that ran off a hillside spring in the valley, was measuring 71 degrees in the afternoon heat. He had product moving towards spoilage faster than he could get it to market. And the market in Springfield was itself overwhelmed with product that every dairy in the region was trying to move at once, which drove the price down precisely when the desperation of the sellers was at its highest. My spring house ran at 54 degrees on the 1st of August, and at 54 degrees on the 15th, and at 54 degrees on the last day of the month. The readings went into the record notebook in the same column, in the same hand, at the same hour each day. The cave did not know it was a drought year. The cave did not know what year it was at all. It simply did what the geology of the Ozark Plateau had arranged for it to do, which was move cold air upward through limestone at a temperature that the mathematics of the Earth's crust determined and that no surface condition could materially affect. They came in September. That was when the full consequence of the summer arrived at the ridge, not as weather, but as people one after another climbing the track on foot or by truck or by horse, arriving at the spring house door with the specific posture of people who have come to ask for something they know they need, more than the person they are asking needs to give it to them. There is a particular kind of humility in that posture that has nothing to do with character and everything to do with circumstance. The humility of someone who has run out of alternatives and knows the person across from them has not. The first was a man named Doyle Caffrey, who ran a small dairy operation on 40 acres at the north end of the valley, and who arrived on a Tuesday morning in early September with his hat in his hands and a manner so carefully calibrated between dignity and need that I found it easier to simply address the business question directly, rather than let him navigate the approach he had clearly rehearsed on the way up. I asked him what he had and what he needed. He told me. We discussed the available space and the rate and the terms. He left with a contract and drove back down the ridge with the particular straightened posture of a man who has resolved something he was not sure he was going to be able to resolve. After Doyle Caffrey came the Prewitt brothers with their apple operation from the east side of the valley, who needed cold storage for 800 bushels of early variety apples that were going to turn if they did not get them into controlled temperature within the week. After the Prewitt brothers came a woman named Mrs. Aldine Boggs, who ran a small egg and butter operation on her late husband's 20 acres, and who had driven up the ridge in a cart behind the oldest horse I had seen in working use, sitting very straight and speaking very precisely, and making it clear in every sentence that she was conducting a business transaction and not requesting charity. I respected that enormously. I gave her the best terms I could offer and still keep the operation sound. Because a person who maintains their precision under that kind of pressure has earned honest dealing. Then came the dairymen, 6 of them, over the course of 3 weeks, each one arriving with some variation of the same story and some variation of the same posture. I worked through each arrival the same way, asking what they had and what they needed and what they could pay, and filling the spaces on the shelves according to what was available, and writing the contracts in plain language and keeping copies in the tin box that had once held Edmund's notebooks and now held the documentary record of what his notebooks had made possible. The shelves filled. We built more. Zeb and I worked 4 consecutive Saturdays, extending the second room along the back wall where Edmund had marked the stone with a pencil line, indicating where he had intended the shelving to go. A pencil line that had been there since 1921, and that I had been stepping over for 8 months without quite being ready to act on it. We were ready now. The extension added another 20 feet of capacity, and we filled it within a week of finishing it. And then on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of September, I heard a truck on the Ridge Road. I knew the truck. I had seen it at the bottom of the Valley Road many times. The dark green of the Holt Dairy operation, the largest truck of its kind in Douglas County. The truck that moved Crispin Holt's product to market in quantities that announced without any need for statement that this was the operation against which all other operations in the county measured themselves. I heard it coming up the Ridge Road from a quarter-mile away, the engine working against the grade. And I stood at the spring house door and watched it come up through the cedars and park in the flat space beside the barn. Crispin Holt got out alone. He was a large man, Holt, the kind of physical presence that fills a room without intending to, that reads as authority before it reads as anything else. He had been the largest man in the room at Mr. Vance's office in March of 1923 physically and in every other sense, And he had used that largeness with the casual confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt that the room will organize itself around his presence. He walked from the truck to the springhouse door with his hat in his hands. I had not seen Crispin Holt hold his hat before. It changed the geometry of him in a way that was more significant than anything he was going to say. He stood at the door and looked inside. He looked at the shelves, the full 30 feet of slatted oak running the length of the main chamber, stacked with butter wrapped in paper and cheese wrapped in cloth and apples, in crate beds of dry straw and eggs set in sawdust and wooden flats. All of it cold and dry and still in the steady 54-degree air that moved through the chamber without hurry and without variation. He stood and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, without turning from the shelves, that he had laughed at me in the office of Ellery Vance in the spring of last year. I said I knew that. He said he had been wrong. I said I knew that too. He turned and looked at me, then directly, which I thought took something, whatever it takes for a man who has always been the largest presence in every room he enters, to look directly at a woman half his size, who has just said, I know that, in response to two things he has admitted. He said that he had 600 pounds of butter he needed to get into cold storage before the end of the week, or he was going to lose it the way he had already lost the last 600. He said he understood if there was no space. He said he would pay whatever the rate was. I told him the rate. It was the same rate I had offered every other customer, not discounted, because I felt generous about his situation, and not inflated because I remembered what his laughter had sounded like in Mr. Vance's front room. It was the rate the operation required to function soundly and pay Zeb his shares and keep the shelves maintained and the records current and the building in the condition Edmund had designed it to be, in which was good condition. Because good condition was the condition that made the product good, and the product being good was the entire argument. He said that was a fair price and he would bring the butter up the next morning. When he turned to go, I said his name and he stopped. I said that he had also said something in Mr. Vance's office. He thought a moment. Then he said that he had said I was more like Edmund than Edmund had probably imagined. I said Edmund was smarter than all of you. Holt was quiet for a moment. He held his hat at his side and looked at the limestone face of the ridge above the springhouse roof, the gray stone in the September light, the cedars moving at the top. He said that Edmund was not smarter. He said Edmund was more patient, and that he had spent a long time believing those were the same thing and had recently had reason to understand they were not. I did not say anything to that. He nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a sentence rather than a conversation, and walked back to his truck and drove down the ridge. The butter came the next morning, 600 pounds of it in 50-pound packing tubs, loaded by Holt's men from the truck into the second room of the inner chamber, where Zeb and I had just finished the final shelf extension. I checked the temperature when the last tub was in place and the inner door was sealed. 54 degrees, the same as always. October arrived and the heat broke, as heat eventually always breaks, not gradually, but all at once. A 3-day stretch of rain that came in from the northwest and dropped the temperature 15 degrees and turned the valley road to mud and filled the creek at the bottom of the hollow back up to something approaching its normal level. The farmers in the valley came out after the rain and looked at their pastures and their rain gauges with expressions that combined relief with the particular exhaustion of people who have been holding tension in their bodies for 3 months and are now slowly releasing it, the way a rope that has been pulled tight goes gradually slack. The dairy operations began to reopen their own facilities as the temperatures dropped and the remaining commercial ice became adequate again for the shorter warm days of autumn. The product that had been stored in the springhouse through the worst of the drought began to move back down the ridge to its owners in better condition than it had arrived, in the butter still firm, the cheese aged, well past where it had been when it came up the ridge. The apples cool and sound in their crate beds of straw. The operators who received their product back made notes in the way that people make notes about things they intend to remember, about the difference between the condition of what they got back and the condition of what they had been losing in July and August. I did not need to advertise this difference. The product spoke for itself the way it always had, the way Edmund had understood it would, which was why he had spent 13 years making sure the conditions that produced it would be in place for whoever came after him. Harlan Becker came on an evening in the middle of October. He came alone, which I had not seen him do before on foot, rather than by vehicle, which meant he had walked up from wherever he had left his car on the valley road. He arrived at the ridge as the light was going from gold to the particular blue-gray of an Ozark evening, the valley below already in shadow, while the top of the ridge still caught the last of the sun. He stood on the porch and looked out over it, not at me, just out at the valley spread below the farms in the flat, with their lights coming on. In the early dusk, the road a pale line through the darkening fields. I did not invite him in. I stood in the doorway and waited. He said that he had been trying to purchase Ashner's Ridge for 10 years on behalf of the Holt Dairy operation, which wanted the lower pasture acreage for expanded summer grazing. He said this without preamble as a statement of established fact, rather than confession, the way you state the beginning of a story that both parties already know. He said that he had made 4 offers to Edmund over those 10 years, each one higher than the last. Each one declined without detailed explanation. He had assumed the refusals were sentimental. He had assumed that Edmund was the kind of man who holds on to land past the point of rational calculation because of some attachment to the land itself, some feeling about the family that had worked it, the kind of reason that Becker had spent his career navigating around when it appeared in sellers treating it as an obstacle between a man and his own practical interest. He said he understood now that he had been wrong about that, as he had been wrong about most of what he had believed about the ridge and the man who had owned it. He looked out at the valley. He said that if he had acquired the property, his plan had been to run the lower 15 acres as summer pasture for the Holt herd and use the timber on the cedar slopes for fencing material. He said he would have filled the surface cracks in the karst formation to prevent livestock from breaking their legs in the openings, which was standard practice on any farm that ran cattle on irregular ground. He would have done this within the first month of ownership as a basic matter of operational safety. He said that in doing so, he would have sealed the primary vent of the cave system, collapsing the air circulation that powered the spring house, destroying in the course of an afternoon's work with shovels and rubble the mechanism that had been running beneath the ground for longer than either of them could comfortably imagine. He would have done it without knowing what he was doing. He would have looked at those cracks in the limestone the way everyone in Douglas County had looked at them for 50 years, as a hazard to be managed rather than a system to be understood, and he would have closed them and moved on to the next item on his operational list. He said very quietly that Edmund Merriweather had not been a fool. He said the word in a way that suggested he was aware it was the word the county had used, the word that had circulated in the feed store and the dairy operations in the back booths of Patton's for 30 years, and that he was using it now with the specific intention of retracting it. He said Edmund was not smarter than all of us, but he was more patient. And it turns out that patience, when it is applied to the right thing over enough time, is indistinguishable from wisdom. He stopped. The valley below was almost fully dark now, the last light gone from the ridgetop, the first stars appearing above the cedar line to the east. I went inside. I went to the shelf where I kept the working inventory of the current week's product, and I took down a cloth-wrapped pound of butter pressed and salted and aged in the inner chamber through the heat of the summer cold and firm and exactly what it was supposed to be. I carried it out to the porch and held it out to Becker. He looked at it. He looked at me. He took it with both hands, not grabbing, but receiving the way you take something when you understand the full weight of what is being offered, which was not butter and which both of us knew was not butter. He said nothing. He walked to the edge of the porch steps and then down into the yard and then down the ridge track into the dark, and I watched his shape diminish against the pale rock of the path until the cedars closed behind him and he was gone. I stood on the porch for a while after. Edmund had done that, given something away on the way out, regardless of how the person had treated him. Zeb had told me that in the first weeks of our acquaintance, mentioned it as an example of the kind of man Edmund was, the kind of gesture that is not generosity in the conventional sense, but something older and harder to name, the refusal to let another person's behavior determine the quality of your own. I had not planned the butter. I had simply gone inside and taken it from the shelf because it was the thing that needed to happen, the closing of a circle whose beginning I had not been old enough to witness, but whose end I was standing in the middle of. Behind me in the dark of the inner chamber, the shelves held what they had always held. Product made honestly stored in the cold that Edmund had found, and I had learned to use. The ridge did not know what had just happened on its porch. It did not need to know. It simply continued as it had always continued, doing its patient work in the dark, the way it had done for 10,000 years before any of us arrived to notice it. Garrett Nellis came into my life properly in the winter of 1924. Though I had seen him before once in Willow Bend in the early months of my time on the ridge, and once again at the Springfield Market in the autumn of 1923, where he had been delivering product from his father's cheese-making operation in Wright County. He was 23, quieter than the room generally expected, with the kind of attentiveness that tends to get mistaken for shyness, until you have spoken to a person long enough to understand that what looks like reticence is actually listening. He had not been in the room at Mr. Vance's office in March of 1923. When I told him that later, he said that he had not been in Willow Bend at all that week and that he was sorry to have missed it. He said it seriously, not as a joke, meaning that he was sorry to have missed the moment of what I had decided in that room, because he thought it was important to have been present for things like that when they happened. I did not know what to do with that for a moment, and then I understood that it was simply honest, the way he was simply honest about most things, and that honest was what I had been looking for since before I knew I was looking. We married in the spring of 1929 in the Willow Bend Church, a small ceremony because neither of us had family to speak of, in quantities that required a large one, and because a small ceremony suited the way we both understood the day, which was as a practical arrangement between two people who had already been living as though it were true for long enough that the formal acknowledgement of it felt more like a record entry than a transformation. Zeb and Nella came. Miss Louetta Strand came, who had become over the years a genuine ally, and what I can only describe as a friend, though she would have used the word colleague first and friend second, which was her way of protecting the professional from the personal in a manner I understood from the inside. Dr. Fenwick sent a letter as he was in Wisconsin for the season. Our first child was a daughter born in the spring of 1930, and we named her Edna. Not a family name with prior associations that would weight it in ways we had not chosen, but close enough to Edmund that anyone who knew the story would understand the echo, which was the kind of closeness I wanted, close enough to honor without close enough to burden. Edna grew up knowing the spring house the way you know a place you have been taken to since before you can remember, with the specific intimacy of early exposure, the knowledge in the body that precedes knowledge in the mind. She could tell the temperature of the inner chamber by feel before she was old enough to read the thermometer, which was the same ability Edmund had described in Notebook 1 when he explained how he had first known the southwest vent was worth investigating. I wrote that down in the record notebook when I noticed it and put the date beside it. The second child was a boy we named Henry, and the third was another girl, Ruth, who arrived in 1934 with a temperament so apparently aligned with the methodical patience of the family enterprise that Garrett said within the first week that she was going to end up running the place. And he was not wrong, though it took longer than a week to establish. Dr. Fenwick's report from the 1923 survey had gone to the University of Missouri, as he had said it would, and it had been received there with the kind of interest that academic institutions show towards significant natural phenomena that happen to occur within their geographic mandate, which is to say that it was noted, filed, discussed in certain departmental settings, and then set aside until someone had the resources and the specific inclination to follow it further. That someone arrived in the summer of 1931 when the university sent a 3-person survey team to Ashner's Ridge to conduct a full systematic mapping of the cave system that Edmund had partially documented in his 14 notebooks. They were there for 2 summers, 1931 and 1932. They brought equipment I had not seen before, and methods Edmund had not had access to, rope rigs and measured lighting systems and survey instruments calibrated to tolerances his fishing line could not achieve. And they mapped what he had mapped, and then went further into the passages he had not been able to reach alone, down into the sections that required partners and ropes, and the kind of technical preparation that a man working by himself on a Douglas County ridge in 1910 simply could not have assembled. What they found confirmed everything Edmund had documented and extended it considerably. Four main galleries, not three. The small underground stream Edmund had found in Notebook 6 was connected to a larger system than he had been able to trace, a hydrological network that ran beneath the south face of the ridge and emerged, as far as the surveyors could determine, in a series of small springs along the valley floor that the valley farmers had always considered independent features of the landscape and had never thought to connect to anything above. An underground lake, the size of a large room in the deepest gallery at 60 feet below the surface. Clear water over white limestone, cold and still and completely invisible from above, unsuspected by everyone who had ever walked that ground. A second cold air vent on the east slope, smaller than the southwest vent that Edmund had noted in Notebook 9, but had not been able to fully characterize. The surveyors measured it and found it operating at the same baseline temperature as the primary vent. The two of them representing the two main exhaust points of a cave system, whose interior temperature, established by the thermal properties of the surrounding bedrock at that depth, was 54 degrees and had been for as long as the limestone had been at its current depth, which the geologist who reviewed the survey report estimated at somewhere between 8 and 12,000 years. Edmund had been right. He had been right about everything he had written in 14 notebooks on a ridge that the county had called worthless, right in his measurements and his calculations and his projections and his single underlined line about the county having ice failures in the next hard drought. He had been right the way a person is, right when they do not guess, but look when they do not assume but measure. When they do not accept the county's verdict about what is and is not worth investigating, and instead go to the ground themselves with a fishing line and a thermometer and the patience to come back every day for 13 years. The state designation came in 1936. The Missouri State Geological Survey, working from the university's mapping reports and Dr. Fenwick's original documentation, designated Ashner's Ridge as a geological site of scientific interest under a state preservation program established the previous year. The designation came with a modest annual payment, a research access agreement that allowed continued scientific study of the cave system, and a small bronze plaque to be mounted at the primary surface entrance to the cave, which was the southwest crack 4 feet wide at the mouth, the one Edmund had knelt at in August of 1910 with his fishing line running down 40 feet into the dark. The dedication ceremony was in the late summer of 1936, attended by representatives from the university, a man from the State Geological Survey, Miss Louetta Strand, who had been the first official to take Edmund's notebook seriously, Dr. Fenwick, who came down from Wisconsin for the occasion and shook my hand with both of his, Zeb Pruitt and his wife Nella Garrett. Edna at 6 years old, and Henry at 4 and Ruth at 2, who could not yet be expected to understand what was happening, but who was present nonetheless, because I wanted her there. A small collection of county people came as well, some of whom I recognized from the room at Mr. Vance's office 13 years ago, and some of whom were simply curious about the scientific designation, which had been written up in the Springfield paper and generated a modest interest among the county's more educated residents. The plaque was bronze, mounted on a flat face of the limestone beside the southwest opening. It said in the plain language that official designations use Ashner's Ridge Cave System, documented and mapped beginning 1910, of geological and scientific significance for its stable thermal properties and hydrological connectivity. The plaque listed two names beneath the text: Edmund Merriweather, who found the cave; Clara Merriweather, who trusted him. I had written those words myself and submitted them to the Geological Survey as the proposed plaque text, and the survey had accepted them without modification, which I had not entirely expected. I stood at the dedication with Garrett beside me and Edna holding my hand, and the sound of the Ozark summer in the cedars above us, and a man from the university said some prepared words about the significance of the site, and then there was a moment of quiet while everyone looked at the plaque. I looked at the southwest crack in the limestone, 4 feet wide at the surface, irregular at the edges, the stone worn smooth on either side by years of air movement. The cold came up out of it in the August heat, the way it had always come up, patient and constant, 54 degrees against my face from below the ground. The breath of something that did not know about dedications or bronze plaques or county commissioners or commercial license applications or droughts or ice houses or the laughter of a room of people who had decided before looking that a piece of ground was worth $22 and no more. Garrett leaned close and said quietly that Edmund would have liked this. I said I thought Edmund would have liked it better if more people had bothered to look down instead of just walking past. Garrett said that was probably true and squeezed my hand. I am an old woman now. My hands look like Edmund's hands look, the hands I remember from the visiting room in Jefferson City, weathered and capable and carrying the evidence of the work they have done in every line and callus. Edna runs the cold storage operation, has run it for 15 years, with a methodical competence that does not require my involvement and does not ask for my approval, which is the best thing a person can do with what they inherit. Henry is a surveyor in Kansas City, which seems appropriate. Ruth studied karst hydrology at the Missouri School of Mines in Rolla and wrote a doctoral dissertation on the thermal properties of Ozark cave systems that cited Edmund's notebooks, all 14 of them, in its primary bibliography. She sent me a copy of the dissertation when it was finished, and I read the bibliography standing at the kitchen table and then sat down. Edmund Merriweather, 14 field notebooks, 1910 through 1923, unpublished, in family collection. Willow Bend, Missouri. The spring house still runs. The shelves are the same oak replaced twice over the decades as the original boards wore out, but always built to the same dimensions in the same specifications Edmund drew in Notebook 4 with his small, careful hand. The temperature in the inner chamber is 54 degrees this morning. It was 54 degrees yesterday, and it will be 54 degrees tomorrow, and it will be 54 degrees on some morning far after I am gone. When whoever is standing in that chamber will likely not know my name, or Edmund's name, or the story of a girl who walked 30 miles in bad boots and sat in a straight-back chair while a room full of people laughed and then said without being brave, I would like to see it. I will tell you what I know about patience. I do not mean the patience that waits for things to change on their own. I mean the patience that works in the dark, that drops a fishing line into a crack in the ground and counts the feet, that measures the same temperature every month for 13 years and records it in a notebook that nobody will read for another decade. That splits a quarter cord of oak for someone who has not yet arrived and stacks it under a tarp and weights the corners against the wind so the rain cannot get underneath. That kind of patience is not passive. It is the most active thing a person can do. It is the decision made every day and then made again the next day and the day after that to keep going back to the same place with the same tools and the same attention until the ground beneath you gives up what it knows. Edmund spent 13 years learning what was under his feet. Most people spend their entire lives never looking down at all. They walk over their own caves every day and never once kneel at the edge and feel the cold coming up and think something is down there. I mean, to find out what. I know that somewhere in your life there is a 48 acres of broken limestone that the whole room laughed at when your name was read. A way of seeing that nobody values. A crack in the ground that everyone drives past without slowing down. And I know that beneath it, beneath the thin grass of what people think they see, there is something moving, something cold and clean and older than any of us. Something that has been doing its patient work in the dark since before you arrived on this earth and will still be doing it long after you have gone. Harlan Becker stood on my porch in the October dark and said that Edmund was not smarter than all of us. He said Edmund was more patient. And he said that patience applied to the right thing over enough time is indistinguishable from wisdom. I have thought about that sentence for 40 years, and I have not found a place where it is wrong. Edmund Merriweather spent 13 years on his hands and knees at the edge of a hole in the ground, and the county called him a fool. I spent one spring reading his notebooks, and the ridge began to pay. The cave had been there for 10,000 years. It did not need anyone's permission to be what it was. It did not need anyone's recognition to do what it did. It breathed at 54 degrees through every drought and every hard winter, In every room full of people who had decided before looking what the ground above it was worth. What is breathing beneath you that nobody can hear yet? What have they told you is worthless? Kneel down, put your hand on the ground. The cold is already there. It has been waiting longer than you know, and it will still be there patient and unhurried on the morning you finally decide to stop walking past and start paying attention to what the earth beneath your feet has been trying to tell you all along.